The dining room glowed beneath the chandelier, its crystals scattering light across polished silverware and tall glasses filled with water that caught the reflection of candle flames. I stepped inside slowly, my hand brushing the frame of the doorway as if to remind myself I still belonged here, though the deed bore my husband's name and mine. This home now felt more like a stage my daughter controlled. Clarabel's laughter carried across the table. Too loud, too sharp. She rose when she noticed me. Her dress fitted just so, her smile broad for the family gathered. Cousins and neighbors sat in neat rows, Damon at her side nodding silently. And at the far corner, Mr. Thaddeus Vayner adjusted his glasses. The same man who had served as our family's lawyer since Jonas was alive. I walked toward the seat near Clarabel. Sylvie and Oren, my grandchildren, had saved it for me, their small hands tapping the chair in invitation. But Clarabel's eyes cut across the room like a blade. "Don't sit next to me," she said, her voice firm, though the words were spoken with a smile that fooled no one. The room fell quiet. Forks hovered above plates. Conversation froze. I could feel the weight of every stare pressing against me. Sylvie's smile faltered. Oren's eyes grew wide. And Damon shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. I forced my lips into a soft smile. Without a word, I pulled back the chair beside Mr. Vayner and lowered myself into it. His eyes flicked to mine, steady, unreadable, but kind enough to give me a strand of courage as I settled. My hand brushed the side of my handbag. The envelope within rested like a quiet heartbeat, reminding me I hadn't come to this dinner unprepared. I had carried it from my bedroom drawer, tucked it into my bag before stepping out, knowing this night would not be ordinary. The candles flickered, as if stirred by an invisible wind. Clarabel cleared her throat, her laugh returning too quickly, brittle around the edges. She lifted her glass, making some cheerful remark to distract the guests, but the atmosphere had already shifted. I folded my hands on the table, steady and patient, waiting for what would come next. After Jonas passed, the house seemed to echo differently. His footsteps, once steady and deliberate, had left behind a rhythm I sometimes thought I still heard when the nights stretched too long. He had built this place with both hands and sacrifice, brick by brick, convinced it would hold our family together long after he was gone. I remembered the years before the house stood at all, when I bent over sewing machines in Savannah's back rooms, patching suits for men who never learned my name, mending dresses too fine for me to wear. Clarabel was a child then, with ribboned hair and stubborn eyes. I worked my fingers raw so she could go to school in clean clothes, while Jonas took extra shifts to set aside money for this very home. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, the fruit of every weary dawn, now sitting under its roof. I often felt like a guest. Clarabel had a way of making even kindness sound like command. If I folded napkins for the table, she would refold them with a sigh. If I offered to stir a pot, she would glance at Damon with a little laugh, as though my touch ruined the taste. Her voice filled every room, polished and decisive, leaving no space for mine. Damon stood by her side, quiet as a shadow, neither defending me nor challenging her. Still, there were Sylvie and Oren. Their voices softened the sharp edges of the house. Sylvie would press her latest sketch into my hands, cheeks flushed with pride, while Oren climbed into my lap with a book he insisted only I could read properly. They tugged me toward the garden, begged me to watch their games, and wrapped their arms around my waist as though I was the only anchor they trusted. In their presence, I remembered who I had been before Clarabel's voice grew louder than mine, a mother who stitched love into every seam. a wife who believed in the permanence of a home built on devotion. But when the children went to bed and the laughter faded, I was left with the silence of rooms that no longer welcomed me. It was in those silences that I realized love alone could not protect what Jonas and I had built. The basket of laundry was warm against my hip, the scent of soap still clinging to the cotton as I walked down the hallway. I had done this task thousands of times in my life, but that afternoon the routine carried me closer to something I was never meant to hear. Clarabel's voice slipped through the crack of her bedroom door, sharp and clipped, lowered, but not enough to be hidden from walls that carried every sound. "Once the property is under our name," she said, each word weighted with determination. "She won't have a say. The house, the savings all ours. Damon agrees it's the simplest way." I froze mid-step. My hands clenched the towel so tightly the folded edge pressed hard against my palm. The air thickened, and though my heart pounded in my ears, her words rang clear. It wasn't just control she wanted. She wanted to erase me from the life Jonas and I had built, as though my years of labor, sacrifice, and devotion meant nothing. I moved quietly past the door before she could hear me, lowering the basket onto the bed in my room. My legs trembled, and I sat down hard on the mattress for a long while. I stared at the neat piles of folded laundry, their order mocking the storm within me. When night came, and the house lay silent, I lit the small lamp on my dresser. Jonas's photograph stood there, his smile faint but steady, a reminder of the man who had carried our burdens beside me. "You worked your whole life for this family," I whispered to him, my fingers brushing the frame. "I won't let them dishonor your memory." Patience had been my shield, but patience alone would not save what was left. That night, I understood I could no longer wait for respect to return on its own. I had to act, quietly and firmly, before everything we built was stolen. The next morning, I carried my resolve across the cobblestone streets of Savannah's historic square. The air was damp with the scent of river water, and Spanish moss swayed gently above me as I walked toward the brick building that housed Mr. Thaddeus Vaynar's office. I had passed that doorway countless times with Jonas, never imagining I would one day step through it alone to defend what we had built. Inside, the space was modest, the kind that spoke of years of steady work rather than grandeur. Shelves leaned under the weight of thick law books, their spines faded with age. The smell of old paper and polished wood settled over me like a memory. Mr. Vaynar looked up from his desk as I entered. He was older now, his hair thinner, but his eyes carried the same steady clarity I remembered from the days when Jonas consulted him about business matters. "Mrs. Marin," he said, standing to greet me. "It's been too long." I sat across from him, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the words that had poisoned my hallway only days before. I told him everything, Clarabel's voice behind the door. Her plan to take the house, the savings, to leave me voiceless. He listened without interruption, nodding now and then, his brow furrowing with concern. When I finished, silence filled the room except for the ticking of a small brass clock. "Your husband left explicit instructions," he said at last, his voice calm but firm. "The house remains in your name. That cannot be contested. And the trust fund he ensured it would be protected for Sylvie and Oren, with you as guardian. Unless you willingly sign away those rights, Clarabel cannot succeed." A wave of relief washed over me, but it carried with it a sharper tide of strength. "Then let's make sure everything is secure," I said. We spent the next hour reviewing documents, preparing copies, reinforcing what Jonas had set in place. Mr. Vaynar's pen scratched steadily across the pages, Each stroke, another stone laid in the wall I needed. Before I left, he looked at me over the rims of his glasses. She thinks you're powerless. Let her. I walked back into the Savannah sun with the envelope pressed firmly against my chest, knowing patience alone was no longer my only defense. 2 weeks later, Clarabel's voice rang through the hallway, bright and commanding as ever. She was telling Damon to polish the silver and asking the children to keep their shoes clean because tonight is special. She called it a family celebration, though I had long since learned her celebrations often came wrapped around some hidden intention. This time, she had invited not only the cousins and a few distant relatives, but also Mr. Vaynar. The moment I heard his name, I knew what she was planning. Clarabel never hid her hunger for recognition, and when she performed as hostess, there was always more than food on the table. I returned to my room with a steadiness I had not felt in years. I opened the cedar wardrobe where Jonas's jacket still hung and chose the simple blue dress he had once admired. It was not the flashiest garment, but it carried a dignity I needed. I slipped it on and felt as though a part of him had come to stand with me. At the dresser, I reached for the sealed envelope Mr. Vaynar had given me. Sliding it into my handbag, the papers inside confirmed everything Jonas had arranged. The shield I would need if Clarabel pressed too far. I touched the clasp and whispered under my breath, "I am ready." For the rest of the afternoon, I rehearsed silence, practiced the steady face that betrayed nothing. There would be no raised voice from me, no public begging. Clarabel could posture and strut as she pleased. I would let her believe I was cornered, and in that belief, she would expose herself. As evening fell, the house shimmered with candlelight and the air filled with the smell of roasted meat. Relatives arrived with gifts, laughter echoing through the hall, while Clarabel glided between them with practiced charm. To anyone else, she looked the picture of grace. But I knew this dinner was no feast of unity. I smoothed my dress, took one last glance at the envelope in my bag, and stepped into the glow of the dining room, ready for whatever she had prepared. The chandeliers sparkled above us, scattering shards of light across the long table. Clarabel moved through the room as if she owned the very air, her fitted dress catching every gleam, her voice rising above the chatter with rehearsed laughter. She tapped glasses, complimented dishes she hadn't cooked, and let her hand rest possessively on Damon's shoulder while he nodded along. Silent and obedient, the guests admired everything: how beautiful the table looked, how tender the roast tasted, how lucky Damon was to have such a capable wife. I smiled politely when eyes turned toward me, but the truth pressed heavy against my ribs. I knew what this gathering was meant to disguise. Sylvie and Oren slipped to my side, tugging at my skirt. "Grandma, sit by us," they whispered, their hands warm and insistent. Their voices were a balm, a reminder that I was not as invisible as Clarabel wished me to be. But Clarabel's voice sliced across the room before I could move. "Mother? Sit at the far end. We need space here for the discussion." She said it lightly, almost cheerfully. But the command in her tone left no doubt. For a moment, the humiliation stung so sharply it felt as if every guest could see the red flush rise to my cheeks. To be ordered away from my grandchildren, from the heart of the table. In my own home, it cut deep. I drew a breath, smoothed my dress, and smiled as though the words had not wounded me. Instead of obeying, I walked with quiet steps to the chair beside Mr. Vaynar. He glanced at me as I sat, his expression unreadable, but his subtle nod steadying me. The envelope in my bag pressed against my side like a secret ally. Clarabel's eyes flickered with fury, quick as lightning. But in the next instant, she forced a laugh, high-pitched and brittle. She lifted her glass, turning back to her audience, pretending nothing had shifted. But the room had changed. She knew it. And so did I. I folded my hands on the table, calm and patient, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. The plates had been cleared, the clatter of forks replaced by the faint hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Candles burned lower, their wax dripping steadily as if marking the time that Clarabel had been waiting for. She leaned forward, her shoulders squared, her smile sharpened into something rehearsed and regal. "Now we finalize matters," she announced, her voice cutting across the table like a bell. "Mr. Vaynar, the documents, please." Her tone left no room for doubt, at least not in her mind. She believed the moment was hers. Damon nodded, faintly, and Michael, my son-in-law, trapped between loyalty and guilt, kept his eyes fixed on his untouched glass of wine. His silence was an old ache, one I had grown too familiar with. Mr. Vaynar adjusted his glasses, unhurried, and placed a thick folder onto the table. The weight of it silenced every whisper. I felt Clarabel's anticipation swell beside me, the satisfaction already blooming in her posture, as though victory were a certainty. But when Vaynar spoke, his words shifted the air like a storm breaking over calm waters. "Per Jonas Marin's instructions," he said clearly, "the property remains under Mrs. Isolde Marin. Sole ownership, non-contestable." Gasps rippled down the table. A cousin dropped his fork. Even the children stopped their quiet whispering, their eyes darting between us as if sensing something far greater than they could name. Clarabel's smile faltered, her mouth opening and closing once before sound returned to her. "That's not what we discussed." Mr. Vaynar raised a hand, firm and unshaken. "The law is clear. Your father's wishes were precise." Her face flushed crimson, the practiced grace draining from her features as swiftly as the blood drained from mine when I had first overheard her schemes. Except this time, it was she who stood exposed. I kept my gaze steady, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while the silence thickened. For so long she had believed my quietness meant weakness. Now the truth sat on the table, heavier than any accusation I could have spoken. And still, the night was not finished. Clarabel's hand came down hard on the table, rattling glasses and sending a fork clattering onto the floor. "She's too old to manage it." She spat, her composure finally cracking. "This is outrageous." The room stilled. Faces turned toward her, startled by the sudden fury that stripped away her charm. For years she had wrapped her ambition in a smile, but tonight the mask slipped clean away. Mr. Vaynar's voice cut through the tension, low but unyielding. "Age is not weakness. It is experience. Your father entrusted her for good reason, and the law affirms his decision." His words fell like a gavel, final and sharp. Damon lowered his eyes, his hand tightening around his glass, though he did not speak. The guests shifted in their seats, murmurs rising like wind before a storm. No one dared side with Clarabel now, not when her anger boiled so plainly. Michael's voice broke through the din, rough at first, then steady. "Mom deserves this," he said, finally lifting his head. His gaze met mine, full of guilt that had been long in the making. Dad wanted it this way. I should have defended her sooner. The air changed with those words. My son-in-law had stood silent for so long, letting Clarabel lead the chorus. But in that moment, his allegiance bent back toward truth. I turned to my daughter, my own voice calm but unshakable. "You told me to sit somewhere else," I said softly, the weight of my words carrying through the silence. "But I chose this seat because here, my voice is heard." Sylvie and Oren pressed against me, their small arms circling mine, their faces alight with trust. Their presence gave me more strength than any document could. Clarabel's breath came fast, her fury boiling, but she had no words left to hurl. Around us, the table no longer felt like hers. The battle she thought she controlled had already slipped beyond her grasp, and every guest could see it. The storm had broken, but its echoes had not yet settled. Weeks passed, and the house settled into a quieter rhythm. The frantic preparation of that dinner had left its scent behind, but now it was replaced by the gentle perfume of roses blooming along my windowsill. The sunlight poured through the glass each morning, warming the wood beneath my feet, and for the first time in years the air inside these walls felt like mine again. The trust for Sylvie and Oren was secured, signed and sealed beyond interference. Mr. Vaynar had made certain every clause was clear, every line unbreakable. The house remained legally in my name, as Jonas had intended. It was no longer a battlefield, but a home, and the weight I had carried for so long lifted each time I crossed a threshold. Clarabel kept her distance after that night. She sent no messages except the occasional clipped email about school schedules. Damon, once her silent echo, grew almost deferential in his tone when we crossed paths, as if he too had seen something at that table that shifted his understanding of me. Every afternoon, Sylvie and Oren burst through the front door with their backpacks and laughter, their presence bright and unfiltered. They spread their homework across the same dining table where Clarabel had tried to erase me, and I sat with them, guiding their hands through sums and spelling lists, the house echoing with the sound of pencils and small voices instead of arguments. One morning, as the river breeze drifted through the window, I trimmed a single rose and placed it in a glass jar beside Jonas's photograph. The petals caught the light like tiny flames. I touched the frame with my fingertips and whispered. They tried to erase me, but I remained, looking at the flowers and the photo together. I understood what endurance meant. Love may open doors, but only respect keeps them open. I stayed at the window as Sylvie's laughter floated from the hallway, the sound threading through the rooms like a promise. I turned toward it, knowing this house, this family, and my own voice were no longer fading but rooted firmly where they belonged.